The snow never stopped falling on Viral Prime, a planet of endless white plains and crystal blue skies that mask the cold silence of politics beneath. It was chosen as neutral ground for the high-level diplomatic meeting between Earth and the mighty Aurelian Empire, a superpower that controlled hundreds of star systems and prided itself on logic over emotion, law over mercy. The Terran delegation, led by seasoned Ambassador Cale Rowan and his team of 6, arrived days ahead, hopeful that years of tension could end in peace and trade. They were welcomed with routine formality, cold handshakes, and rehearsed smiles, but no one suspected betrayal lurking behind the silver walls of the Grand Accord Chamber. 3 days later, everything collapsed. Just before the final agreement was to be signed, an explosion rocked the Aurelian transport hub, killing 40 Empire citizens, and before the smoke cleared, the blame was thrown directly at the humans. Evidence was presented too swiftly images, false transmissions, and staged footage showing the Terran delegation planning the attack, even though they had never left the embassy compound. Earth's objections were ignored. No trial was held. No time was given. The Aurelian High Council, made of towering, pale blue beings with eyes like polished glass, declared the human team guilty of galactic terrorism and sentenced them to immediate execution. It was not a private decision. The entire event was broadcast live across the galaxy, a show of power meant to remind everyone that the Empire did not tolerate weakness. One by one, the Earth diplomats were forced onto the frozen stage of Viral's northern plateau, their hands bound, their voices silenced, as beams of icy energy took their lives in front of billions. There was no mercy, not even for the young communications officer who cried for her family in her last moments. The broadcast ended with the Aurelian emblem glowing across every screen order had been restored. But far from Viral, on Earth's lunar base, one man watched the transmission in complete silence. His name was Dorian Vex, a human diplomat unlike any other trained in negotiation, fluent in 17 languages, but with a past buried deep in covert intelligence operations. He had worked with the very team that had been executed. He had trained with Cale Rowan and knew the kindness and patience those people had shown even in hostile space. He also knew one thing with certainty: they had been framed. The precision of the setup, the speed of judgment, the performance of the execution, it all screamed conspiracy. While Terran leaders debated sanctions and statements, Dorian remained quiet. He didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't threaten. He requested a solo diplomatic mission to the Aurelian homeworld under official Terran policy of seeking peaceful resolution. On the outside, he looked like a grieving man carrying the burden of tragedy. Inside, however, something far colder burned. As his ship neared the glowing spires of the Aurelian capital, he opened a secured file buried in his personal drive. Its name was Operation Frostveil. No words were spoken, but his eyes stayed fixed on the stars, and his hand trembled only slightly as he activated it. He wasn't here to negotiate peace. He was here for justice and maybe something more. Something the Empire had never seen from humanity before. Something it would never forget. The capital of the Aurelian Empire shimmered like a city built from frozen light, towers of silver and glass, reaching toward the stars, cold and perfect like the people who ruled it, but beneath its beauty, something darker was beginning to stir. Dorian Vex walked through the great halls of the Imperial Council with the calm of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, dressed in the white robes of an Earth diplomat, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp and calculating. The council chamber was vast, circular, filled with the tall, elegant forms of the Aurelians who watched him with silent disdain, their pale eyes reflecting no emotion as they listened to his official request for an independent investigation into the execution on Viral Prime. He spoke clearly, respectfully, asking for a trial, for transparency, for a hearing of facts, but he knew before the words left his mouth that the Empire would reject every offer. And they did, with cold smiles and clipped words, calling the matter closed, saying the evidence was irrefutable, and dismissing the Terran response as emotional noise from a young species. Dorian nodded once, thanked them for their time, and left the chamber with quiet grace, but the storm within him had already begun. Back in his private residence, Far from listening ears, he activated hidden channels, old networks from his intelligence days. Whispers and codes passed through outlaw traders, rebellious scientists, and former agents who still owed him favors. One by one, he reawakened contacts spread across the galaxy, telling them only this: the time has come. Using encrypted signals and ghost data routes, he began leaking classified documents not from Earth, but from deep inside the Aurelian archives, records of corruption, secret wars, broken treaties, and brutal experiments on smaller species, all signed and sealed by the very council that had murdered the Terran diplomats. The files spread like wildfire, appearing on black market streams, rogue broadcasts, and even public forums. Species who had feared the Empire for generations now saw the truth, and many began to question their loyalty. Some planets demanded explanations. Others quietly stopped sending tribute. A few brave ones broke ties completely. Meanwhile, Dorian continued to smile in public meetings, his voice polite, his posture respectful, even as the council grew uneasy. They confronted him behind closed doors, asking how the data was released, accusing Earth of cyber warfare, but he denied everything with perfect calm, his hands open, his tone peaceful. "We seek only understanding," he said, again and again, while the galaxy slowly turned against the Empire. The Aurelians tried to strike back by controlling the flow of information, but Dorian had already placed silent allies in key communication hubs. No firewall could stop the truth now. In the streets of the capital, quiet protests began small at first, barely noticed, but growing each day. Alien workers from low-class colonies refused to follow orders. Aurelian citizens themselves began to whisper about what they had never dared question before. Behind closed doors, Dorian met with representatives from species long silenced by the Empire, scholars from the Navari halls, engineers from the Brunt Collective, even former military officers from the Outer Rim. He offered them nothing but truth and let them decide for themselves. Most walked away changed. Back on Earth, some leaders were concerned with his methods, calling for caution, but others watched with awe as one man, without a fleet or a weapon, began to crack the foundation of a galactic superpower. Still, Dorian never raised his voice, never made a threat. He simply reminded the universe of what the Empire had done. He reminded them with silence, with facts, and with the faces of the fallen. One night, during a formal dinner hosted by the High Chancellor himself, Dorian was asked once again what he hoped to achieve. He lifted his glass and looked into the eyes of the man who had signed the death order for his friends. "I am only here," he said softly, "to help you understand how humans deal with grief." The room went quiet. Even the Chancellor said nothing. The message was clear, and it was not about sadness. It was about consequence. Outside the city, more rebellion sparked across minor systems, and the Empire's resources began to stretch thin. Ships were recalled. Security was doubled. But the leaks didn't stop. Dorian's information web ran deep, and with each revelation, trust in the Empire cracked further. A respected ambassador from the Vaori sector called the executions a crime against diplomacy. The council held emergency sessions, trying to repair their image, but every step only revealed how desperate they had become. Dorian, always calm, watched the cracks grow. He sent no demands, issued no ultimatums. He simply continued, layer by layer, to remove the mask the Empire had worn for centuries. The galaxy watched, holding its breath. Then, one afternoon, a frightened Aurelian aide delivered a secure message to the High Council that contained video footage of the Empire staging the evidence against the Terran delegation, stolen from their own internal database. It had been released anonymously, signed only with a single line: "Justice is colder than ice." The council erupted into chaos. Some denied it, others panicked. A few called for immediate damage control. But it was too late. That night, for the first time in Aurelian history, protesters marched outside the Grand Chamber, carrying holograms of the executed humans and chanting for truth. And in his private chamber, Dorian Vex sat in the dark, watching it all unfold, his face still calm, his expression unreadable, but his purpose clear. He had not come for war. He had come to tear apart an empire, one truth at a time. The Empire, once a symbol of unshakable control, now trembled beneath the surface as quiet unrest turned into loud defiance across its outer colonies and even within the heart of its own capital. Dorian Vex had become more than a diplomat. He had become a symbol, not just to humans, but to every species that had ever felt the cold hand of the Aurelians on their throat. His name was whispered in back alleys, in merchant circles, and even among Aurelian citizens who began to see him not as an enemy, but as a necessary voice in a system built on fear. The leaked evidence of false charges, secret councils, and manipulation of justice could no longer be denied, and as more proof surfaced each week, cracks began to appear not only in the walls of the empire, but in the minds of its people. Some high council members began quietly distancing themselves from decisions they once proudly endorsed, while others clung desperately to their authority, demanding new laws to tighten control, but their desperation only fueled more rebellion. On planets like Delcar 4 and Rasari Prime, citizens marched in the thousands, demanding freedom and refusing to ship goods to the core worlds. Imperial troops were deployed, but some refused orders, sympathizing with the protesters. In one shocking moment, a full fleet stationed near the edge of the Tovarian belt turned off their comms and declared independence, joining the rising coalition of breakaway systems calling themselves the Free Axis. All of it had started with Dorian's careful campaign of truth, and yet he remained strangely silent as the galaxy erupted. He didn't call for war, didn't give speeches, didn't even claim credit. He simply watched and moved behind the scenes like a shadow with purpose. Inside his secured quarters, he received reports daily, not just from humans, but from defectors within the Empire who now trusted him more than their own leaders. His network grew, invisible and unstoppable, made of spies, diplomats, traitors, and citizens who wanted to see the Empire fall, not with bombs, but with justice. One of the Aurelian high generals, a ruthless leader named Cor Vultan, demanded Dorian's arrest, calling him a threat to peace, but the council hesitated. Dorian still carried official diplomatic immunity, and any move against him could be seen as further abuse of power. Besides, they knew by now that if they touched him, it would only turn him into a martyr. So they tried something else. The Empire's communication ministry released a new wave of propaganda, accusing Earth of funding terrorist groups, using artificial footage to place Dorian in secret meetings with violent separatists. But the tactic failed, as thousands of independent AI systems across the galaxy exposed the edits within hours. The truth had become its own defense. And while the Empire struggled to protect its image, Dorian made his boldest move, yet he arranged a private meeting with representatives from 5 of the largest alien species under Aurelian rule, offering them protection and support in exchange for open rebellion. The meeting took place in deep space aboard a neutral station, far from prying eyes, but not far enough from Empire sensors. An Aurelian cruiser attempted to intercept the talks, but before it could fire, its systems failed completely, its weapons frozen, engines locked, and internal lights flickering in silence. The crew later reported no damage, just that something had overridden their control. They never saw who or what caused it. Dorian, of course, said nothing. But in the following days, Earth's Navy began training exercises near key Empire trade routes, never firing a shot, just watching. Watching and waiting. Inside the Empire, fear grew faster than rebellion. Council members turned on each other, blaming internal leaks, traitors, even each other's families. Emergency meetings became common, and decisions were made with shaking hands and paranoid eyes. And still, Dorian remained calm, meeting with ambassadors, offering peaceful solutions, his words always measured, always polite, even as everything around him fell apart. One night, during a formal event meant to calm public fear, a young Aurelian reporter broke protocol and asked him if he believed the Empire was dying. Dorian paused, looked directly into the camera, and answered, "Empires do not die in war. They die when truth becomes stronger than fear." That single sentence spread across the stars, translated into 100 languages, printed on walls, carved into statues, even painted on warships that now flew the Free Axis flag. The Aurelians had ruled through control of information, through cold silence and carefully crafted history. But now, with every new truth revealed, their grip weakened, their image cracked, and the fear they used to inspire had turned into anger from every direction. Secret police began arresting citizens suspected of following Dorian's network, but that only proved he had influence they could no longer trace. The High Chancellor himself ordered a full security lockdown on the capital world, but even then, voices of protest could be heard outside the Grand Chamber. One council member suggested offering Earth a deal, perhaps a peace summit, but the Chancellor refused. He said Earth was still a young, emotional species that could not understand the cost of leadership. But in his private thoughts, he began to fear Dorian Vex, not because of what he had done, but because he had done it without raising a single weapon. Meanwhile, in the outer zones of the Empire, ghost ships began appearing, vessels with no official registry, no clear command, but precise tactics. These ships disrupted supply lines, disabled satellites, and erased data centers holding evidence of Imperial corruption. No one could prove it, but many believe these were Terran Black Ops, working under Dorian's hidden hand. Still, no one could catch them. No one even saw them coming. In one intercepted message, a panicked Aurelian officer screamed before losing signal, "They don't fire, they just shut us down." Across the stars, one message began repeating through secure rebel channels, a phrase spoken in many tongues, but always carrying the same weight: the Empire cracks. The frost spreads. Justice is colder than ice. And in the silence of his private chamber, Dorian Vex watched the galaxy shift with quiet eyes and a calm face, knowing the time for words was ending and the final phase was about to begin. The halls of the Aurelian capital had never been this quiet, not even during wartime. Something unspoken filled the air, an invisible weight pressing down on every council member, every soldier, every citizen who once believed in the Empire's perfection. Whispers spread like fire behind closed doors, fueled by fear, by doubt, and by the one name that no one dared say aloud during official meetings: Dorian Vex. He still walked freely through the great dome corridors, still bowed respectfully to guards, still offered calm greetings to Empire staff with the exact same smile he had used since the day he arrived. But now, every Aurelian eye followed him with unease, as if sensing something hidden beneath. That diplomatic tone, something sharp and coiled. The smile had not changed, but the meaning behind it had, and though he still wore the clothes of peace, many had begun to suspect that Dorian Vex was not just a man of words, but a blade carefully sheathed. As the Empire struggled to hold control, the Free Axis expanded faster than anyone predicted, taking planets, allies, and data networks that had once fed directly into the Aurelian core systems, and every time a stronghold fell or a transmission hub went dark, there was no declaration, no war cry. Only silence, followed by another ripple of unrest across the stars. Within the inner circle of the council, voices clashed in desperation. Some demanded Dorian's expulsion. Others argued that doing so would be a final mistake, admitting weakness in front of the galaxy. The High Chancellor grew more paranoid each day, sending elite guards to monitor his own advisors, replacing security teams, changing meeting locations, but the fear only deepened. Every time he addressed the people, his speeches grew shorter, his voice more bitter, and more than once he paused mid-sentence as if realizing he was already losing control. Meanwhile, Dorian continued his silent war. He made no threats, held no press conferences, but in secret meetings beneath the capital, he met with high-ranking defectors from the Empire's military, intelligence, and science sectors, some seeking justice, others simply seeking survival. He offered them no promises, just a single sentence: "It's time to decide what kind of galaxy you want to live in." Many joined him, and those who didn't vanished quietly within weeks. Behind the scenes, Dorian's web tightened. He activated dormant sleeper agents, relayed information across invisible backchannels, and reawakened Terran intelligence protocols that had not been touched in decades. Under his direction, unknown hackers exposed the Empire's deepest lies, revealing a secret slave labor program on the mining moons of Carthus, illegal surveillance on allied species, and the quiet assassination of dozens of peace leaders over the last 50 years. The evidence was undeniable, and with every new revelation, the Empire's moral foundation shattered a little more. Riots broke out even within the Aurelian homeworld cities, something that had never happened in recorded history. Statues were defaced. Government offices stormed. Military units began refusing orders in fear of being recorded, shamed, or hunted down by rebel forces later. And still, Dorian remained untouched, shielded by the same diplomatic rules the Empire had once used to mock his people. But now, those laws protected him from the very empire that made them. He used their rules like weapons. Every legal technicality, every clause of their own diplomatic code turned against them, and he did it all without once raising his voice. His blade was made of patience, precision, and quiet fury. One night, the High Chancellor called for a private negotiation, something that had never happened since the crisis began. Dorian agreed, and they met in the old Star Chamber beneath the capital, a place where ancient treaties had once been signed, long before humans even reached the stars. The Chancellor, once proud and towering, looked older Chancellor himself, ordered a full security lockdown on the capital world. But even then, voices of protest could be heard outside the Grand Chamber. One council member suggested offering Earth a deal, perhaps a peace summit, but the Chancellor refused. He said Earth was still a young, emotional species that could not understand the cost of leadership. But in his private thoughts, he began to fear Dorian Vex, not because of what he had done, but because he had done it without raising a single weapon. Meanwhile, in the outer zones of the Empire, ghost ships began appearing, vessels with no official registry, no clear command, but precise tactics. These ships disrupted supply lines, disabled satellites, and erased data centers holding evidence of Imperial corruption. No one could prove it, but many believed these were Terran Black Ops, working under Dorian's hidden hand. Still, no one could catch them. No one even saw them coming. In one intercepted message, a panicked Aurelian officer screamed before losing signal, "They don't fire, they just shut us down." Across the stars, one message began repeating through secure rebel channels, a phrase spoken in many tongues, but always carrying the same weight: the Empire cracks. The frost spreads. Justice is colder than ice. And in the silence of his private chamber, Dorian Vex watched the galaxy shift with quiet eyes and a calm face, knowing the time for words was ending, and the final phase was about to begin. The halls of the Aurelian capital had never been this quiet, not even during wartime. Something unspoken filled the air, an invisible weight pressing down on every council member, every soldier, every citizen who once believed in the Empire's perfection. Whispers spread like fire behind closed doors, fueled by fear, by doubt, and by the one name that no one dared say aloud during official meetings: Dorian Vex. He still walked freely through the great domed corridors, still bowed respectfully to guards, still offered calm greetings to Empire staff with the exact same smile he had used since the day he arrived. But now, every Aurelian eye followed him with unease, as if sensing something hidden beneath. That diplomatic tone, something sharp and coiled. The smile had not changed, but the meaning behind it had, and though he still wore the clothes of peace, many had begun to suspect that Dorian Vex was not just a man of words, but a blade carefully sheathed. As the Empire struggled to hold control, the free axis expanded faster than anyone predicted, taking planets, allies, and data networks that had once fed directly into the Aurelian core systems, and every time a stronghold fell or a transmission hub went dark, there was no declaration, no war cry, only silence, followed by another ripple of unrest across the stars. Within the inner circle of the council, voices clashed in desperation. Some demanded Dorian's expulsion. Others argued that doing so would be a final mistake, admitting weakness in front of the galaxy. The High Chancellor grew more paranoid each day, sending elite guards to monitor his own advisors, replacing security teams, changing meeting locations, but the fear only deepened. Every time he addressed the people, his speeches grew shorter, his voice more bitter, and more than once he paused mid-sentence, as if realizing he was already losing control. Meanwhile, Dorian continued his silent war. He made no threats, held no press conferences, but in secret meetings beneath the capital, he met with high-ranking defectors now, his voice lined with bitterness as he demanded an end to the chaos, offering vague promises of reform. But Dorian simply listened, his face calm, his eyes sharp. When the Chancellor finally paused, Dorian leaned forward and asked softly, "Would you have offered this mercy to my people, had we begged?" The silence stretched for a long moment, and the Chancellor could not meet his gaze. Dorian rose to leave, but before walking out, he turned and said, "This is not revenge. This is correction." With that, he vanished into the night, leaving the most powerful man in the galaxy with nothing but silence and shame. The very next day, 5 Aurelian star systems declared independence, including the heavily fortified world of Zephyrian, once considered the Empire's military backbone. The loss was devastating, and worse, it was bloodless. Dorian had spoken to their governors weeks before, planting doubt, offering them choices. They had chosen freedom. Panic spread within the council like a virus. Guards were posted outside the homes of high-ranking officials. Families were sent off-world. An emergency defense treaty was signed, but even then, some fleets refused to follow it, unsure who truly commanded them now. The Empire had become a mirror of fear of losing power, fear of Dorian Vex, and worst of all, fear of its own people. Meanwhile, Dorian prepared the final phase. He met with Terran High Command, requesting a fleet not to invade, but to arrive quietly at the edge of the Aurelian core systems as a protective measure for Earth citizens. The move was legal, strategic, and brilliant. It told the galaxy that humanity, once considered young and naive, now had the strength to protect its own without needing permission. The fleet held position, never firing a shot, but its presence was louder than any weapon. Then came the last strike, not by ship or soldier, but by truth. Dorian released one final data package, containing proof that the execution orders on Viral Prime were never based on evidence, but planned weeks in advance as a political stunt to remind the galaxy of the Empire's strength. The files included internal memos, meeting transcripts, and even a private message from the Chancellor himself, laughing at Earth's weakness. When the files hit the galaxy, the effect was instant and violent. Within hours, Empire-loyal systems broke away. Council members resigned or vanished. Even the capital itself fell into chaos as citizens flooded the streets, demanding resignations, justice, and reformation. And while it burned, Dorian Vex stood quietly in the Terran embassy, surrounded by silence, watching the sun rise over a city that no longer belonged to the Empire. The blade behind the smile had struck its final blow, not with war, but with truth sharp enough to cut an empire in half. The Aurelian Empire did not fall in a day, and it did not fall with flames or bloodshed. It fell in silence, the kind that follows a storm when no one knows whether to feel relief or fear what comes next. Dorian Vex stood at the heart of it all, not as a conqueror, not as a leader of rebellion, but as a quiet architect of truth whose presence now lingered like frost across every corner of a shattered galaxy. In the weeks following the release of the final files, what remained of the High Council had either resigned, disappeared, or turned on one another in a desperate attempt to survive the rising tide of public fury. The Empire's symbols were stripped from buildings, banners burned, statues toppled, but Dorian did not celebrate. Instead, he continued working behind closed doors, meeting with former enemy diplomats, rebel leaders, and representatives of species long silenced under the Empire's control. What they built was not a treaty, it was something more fragile, more uncertain. It was a colder kind of peace, not born of forgiveness, but of exhaustion, a shared understanding that no one could return to what was, and no one fully trusted what was coming. Earth offered aid, but no control, rebuilding but no rule, and under Dorian's careful direction, the free axis turned into something real, a council of worlds that operated without dominance, without thrones, a place where truth had value greater than borders. Yet the wounds of the past did not vanish so easily. In cities once lit by Aurelian arrogance, whispers of vengeance still echoed. Rogue generals refused to surrender. Intelligence networks left behind by the Empire twisted themselves into new threats, each trying to reclaim power through manipulation or chaos. Dorian, ever watchful, prepared for this. He had warned the others that toppling the Empire would not end the danger, it would only change its shape. He moved quietly, activating hidden allies, offering peace to those who sought it and cold justice to those who resisted. Some called him ruthless, others called him necessary, but none dared oppose him openly. One night, under the steel sky of the neutral world Tressa, Dorian met with an old enemy general, Cor Valton, the last surviving Aurelian warlord, now a fugitive commander with access to still functioning fleets. They spoke alone, without guards, without weapons, only words. Vultan demanded immunity, claiming that without his surrender, civil war would return. Dorian listened, then handed him a datapad. It contained everything: evidence, testimonies, even personal messages that proved Vultan's crimes. There was no room for denial. "You will disappear," Dorian said quietly, "or I will make sure history never forgets what you did." Vultan left the next morning. No one saw him again. The message was clear. Peace would not come from trust, but from balance, from watching every hand at the table and remembering what silence had once cost them. And so, over time, the galaxy began to breathe again. Trade routes reopened. Former enemies became reluctant allies. A new form of law took root, slow but firm, and while it lacked the iron grip of the old empire, it offered something new, the chance to be heard. Still, Dorian never let down his guard. He knew peace was a fragile thing, like ice it held together only so long as no one pressed too hard. He worked quietly, refusing every offer of leadership, turning down medals, titles, and statues in his honor. He didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to be a reminder. Every year, on the anniversary of the virile executions, Dorian lit a small flame in his quarters, a simple Terran tradition of memory for those who had died not in battle, but in silence. He never spoke during these moments. He only stared into the flickering light, the warmth a quiet contrast to the cold strategies that had brought him this far. People said he was the mind that broke the empire, but few truly understood that it had broken him too. Trust was a thing he had sacrificed long ago. In the halls of power, he moved like a ghost, respected but distant, always one step ahead, always watching. Some feared him, others followed him, but none could ignore him. He had become something more than a diplomat. More than a man, he had become a symbol of what happens when a quiet voice chooses not to remain silent. And across the stars, that symbol lived on, not in monuments or songs, but in policy, in resistance, in the way worlds now pause before passing judgment. The Empire's cold execution had once tried to end a life and send a message of fear. But in the end, that coldness had only sharpened Dorian Vex into the blade that ended them. The peace he built was not warm, not easy, but it was strong in its own way, a peace earned, guarded, and shaped by truth. A colder kind of peace, yes, but one that would not shatter easily.